So thanks very much to Dennis and Teresa for inviting me to present tonight. I am quite honored actually to be presenting to Nature Vancouver. I have delivered this presentation several times before, but mostly to garden clubs and to butterfly rangers. So I'm feeling a little bit out of my depth with Nature Vancouver and all the scientists here, but I will do my best as a very enthusiastic gardener. So my first screen here, you will see the David Suzuki Foundation Butterfly Way project logo. And this is because, oh, sorry. Yes. And I have put this up because I really need to credit the David Suzuki Foundation Butterfly Way project with really changing my gardening practices and changing who I'm actually gardening for. I am much less anthropocentric in my view of the garden now. And that is basically the thrust of this presentation tonight is how we can use our gardens to support the wildlife that we share our gardens with. The other name I have for this presentation is really the more I look, the more I see, and this particularly applies to the winter garden. A lot of people think that there's not a whole lot going on in the garden at winter and stop looking at nature. I think I'm probably speaking to the converted with this audience as far as that goes, but I'm hoping this presentation will give you more of an appreciation for what is going on in the garden around you. So this was the view out my kitchen window. I'm actually just looking for, okay, I will continue. This is the view out of my kitchen window when I was living in Vancouver. And I was sitting at my kitchen table one day after being asked to present at the Butterfly Ranger group at the end of October. And I was wondering how I could make the presentation relevant for the time of year that I was asked to present. And as I'm looking out my kitchen window at this 2-story high pyracantha shrub outside my kitchen window, I was being entertained by the birds hopping around the branches in this shrub. And I initially planted the shrub when I first moved into this house, because you can just make out a window in my neighbor's house that's about 8 feet away. And it was their bathroom window. So I was sort of wanting a 4-season interest shrub outside my kitchen window that avoided looking into their bathroom window. And we were very successful with this privacy screen, but we had inadvertently created the perfect bird habitat with this shrub. And that was really the whole inspiration for creating this talk. So the pyracantha shrub has really dense foliage. It's a multi-branched shrub. It has thorns, which is great for protecting wildlife. It's evergreen, which is nice for us to look at. It has beautiful white flowers in the spring, which are very popular with pollinators. And then in the fall, it has these gorgeous berries, which provide food for the birds in winter. Pyracantha shrub, like the one outside my window, can be very large and rather unwieldy, but you can keep them pruned back quite a bit. And I've seen many used as sort of fencing shrubs. It's helpful if it grows up along some kind of support. It would be a fair bit of work keeping it pruned to this kind of shape, but it is doable. And then you have all the lovely flowers as well as the berries in wintertime. So when I'm talking about wildlife today, I'm going to be specifically referring to the birds, bees, and butterflies. So that's the wildlife I'm talking about, and native birds, bees, and butterflies. And the focus will be on how to support these during the fall and winter months. So basically, wildlife must be able to find food, water, and shelter, safe places to raise their young, and safe passages in our urban and human-dominated landscapes. And of course, protection from pesticides and herbicides. Hopefully that goes without saying. So in terms of water, I'm only going to have one slide on water. And the message here is that all wildlife needs it, and they need it at all times of the year. So even the days when there's snow on the ground outside, if you've been feeding the birds, you should put a little dish of unfrozen water out for them to drink. And I'm sure most people in the audience are replenishing their hummingbird feeders multiple times a day when we have freezing weather. So water can be as simple as a little plant drainage dish, like in the first picture. The picture on the left is in a neighbor's garden in Vancouver. They built this really charming little creek in their front yard. This is a very small city lot. So it was amazing that they were able to build something that looks so naturalistic on a very small lot. And basically this, they have a little pump here, and these rocks at the bottom end at the sidewalk. So it takes up their whole front yard, a little bit more expense and maintenance to do something like this, but quite charming to see this in the city. This is another friend of mine, built this in his backyard. I'm actually just gonna stop my video so that disembodied head isn't up there on the screen. So this one on the right is a passive pond that he has built in his backyard, and you can see the little creek bed down the side, and this is connected to his drainage from his house. And it just passively collects in this little pond. He actually keeps koi in the pond, which have survived for many years. And so he puts netting across the pond to keep the raccoons and herons out of his yard. And this is in the little neighborhood, little mountain neighborhood of Vancouver. So quite a charming little pond that he has here. And this next one was just a really cute little water feature that some neighbors had at the side of their house. So they can be really funky and cute like that too, but just have some water out there for the wildlife. So tonight's presentation, I'll start with the birds. The birds will be the biggest subject tonight, because really fall and winter gardening is all about the birds. And I will talk about habitat for birds, how to create that in our urban environments, seeds and berries, as well as some fall preparation in the garden or lack thereof to support the birds. And then for the bees, I'm going to talk about winter nesting sites, as well as late fall and early spring bloomers. And for the butterflies, we'll again talk about winter habitat and host plants to attract those butterflies to hang around for the winter. So the first subject for birds is thickets. And thickets are dense, impenetrable groups of shrubs or small trees. Often they contain thorns, which are added protection for the birds, such as native roses and bramble bushes create great thickets. In nature, thickets occur at the edges of woodlands. So you have your forest, your thick evergreen forests, and then you have meadows. And at the edges of these two, the transition areas are made of shrubbery that we call thickets. And this is where the birds reside. But because we don't have forests in the city, we can create little thickets like this picture on the left here. This is actually, it was a cute little planting outside a community center in Kerrisdale. The red sticks are a shrubby dogwood, a cornus, and then the red berries are a cotoneaster. So the two tones of red looked absolutely spectacular. This was a picture I think I took late October, early November one year. And on one side of this thicket through the fence here is a daycare playground. And on the other side of me was a grassy boulevard. And guess where the birds were? This little planting was full of birds. And of course, the leaves from the shrubs and the cotoneaster fall to the ground, but nobody cleans out the leaves beneath the thicket. So it had the added benefit of providing an ecosystem with the fallen leaves under the shrubbery for the birds to feast on as well. The picture on the right is a junco, which is probably one of our most common garden songbirds that we have. And you can see how well camouflaged he is with the colors of the stems in this particular thicket. And here's a little sparrow, another common songbird that we see in our gardens. And again, you can see how well camouflaged he is among the sort of gray-brown fall leaves. But he isn't just hanging around in these leaves for camouflage. He's actually foraging for insects and for seeds that are in amongst these leaves as well. So thickets like this can create mini ecosystems in our urban environment. As well as habitat, thickets also provide perches for bird, and all birds love a perch. In my garden, the Japanese maples and the rhododendrons are the favorite hangouts for birds as they come and go from the bird feeders. If you do feed birds in the winter months, if you add either shrubbery that have multiple branches or even have some sticks around, willow sticks or whatever, stems around your feeders, you will get way more birds coming to your feeders because they've got places to hang out. And this is a little chickadee, which is one of our most common birds in our garden as well. And then the two on the right here are a couple of finches, which we also commonly see. The male finch has the very colorful headdress on, and the female certainly has no less attitude than the male, but is a little plainer in appearance. But they are usually seen in pairs in our gardens. This little guy here is a bush tit. He is actually one of the smallest birds in North America. And from beak to tail, he measures about 3 to 4 inches, and the tail takes up almost half of his body. So he's very, very tiny. And if you see one bush tit in your garden, you're probably going to see about 20 because they hang around in large packs and descend on trees and shrubs in the garden to feast on seeds. And this one here on the bottom right is less seen in our gardens. It is a towhee, sometimes mistaken for a robin, but it does look quite different. It's actually got a white breast and its flanks are the orangey terracotta color. And he's a member of the sparrow family. So he's a little bit smaller than a robin, but larger than our juncos. And this guy is the master of kind of lurking under shrubs, and particularly loves thickets and areas where it feels quite protected. And he eats seeds and insects. But when there is snow on the ground, you will sometimes see them coming to your feeder, which is always quite a treat. So habitat provided by thicket shrubs also often have winter berries. And this here is a very common sight. Eating berries is a robin. And this robin is eating the pyracantha berries, which is the shrub I showed at the beginning. Now, when I lived in Vancouver, we had crows nesting in our trees around our house. So we didn't have any robins hanging about because the crows were usually there. But every once in a while I'd see a crow or see a robin in the garden. And I got to know that within a day or two, all the berries off the pyracantha shrub would be gone because flocks of robins would descend in the garden and clean up all the berries. But that's what they do. They love cotoneaster berries and they will descend on the garden in flocks and disseminate the berry bushes all winter long. This here on the top right is a snowberry. So this is a native berry shrub. It's a beautiful thicket-forming shrub to have in your garden. The white berries are poisonous to humans, and it's not a favorite berry of the birds, which is a good thing actually, because the birds leave them alone initially. So later in the winter, when there isn't a lot to choose from, there's always the white berries for them to eat. And it looks spectacular on the winter landscape after the leaves drop from the shrub, and you have these really very attractive white berries there. And then, of course, there's our salal berries. Now, the salal berries, they actually ripen in the middle of the summer, but if they're left on the shrub, there's often a lot of winter forage for the birds on salal berries as well. And berries are a really important source of vitamin C and energy for birds over the winter. And here is a flicker, which is one of our more commonly seen woodpeckers, and he is on a hawthorn tree. And hawthorns are a really great source of winter food as they hold on to their berries really late into the season. And birds must forage all day long for food in the winter months in order to store enough energy to survive those cold nights. Seed heads left on plants in the fall provide a continuous feast for birds over winter. I really love the late fall when the chickadees show up on all the sunflowers that we have in the garden. What's really nice about the fall chickadees is you often see them in packs of 5 or 6 because they still have their offspring from the previous season with them. Normally you just see chickadees in pairs in the garden, but it's so nice to see these larger groupings in the fall. And another chickadee eating some seeds off of a tree branch that has snow on it. This is a pine siskin, which is also another common bird that we see at feeders. At times, the pine siskin populations get to be too much. Fortunately, not the last couple of years, because they can carry disease when their populations increase too much. But they're a pretty little bird, and here it is eating some alder pine cones. And another picture of a pretty red-headed finch. What I really appreciate the more I get to know my local birds and really seeing what's around when is you really get to appreciate when the migratory birds come in. They make an appearance and then they're gone again. These are cedar waxwings that are regularly seen in Vancouver, but unless you're really watching for them, it's easy to miss them and then they take off again. They have this sort of mask of Zorro on them, and they, like the robins, absolutely love the red berries. The cedar waxwings are rather nomadic, gypsy-like birds, kind of like the roaming robins and thrushes. They follow peak fruiting time, so they show up in the late fall and big flocks of them, and they descend on fruiting trees and disseminate all the fruit, and then they move on. So they don't stick around all winter in the Vancouver area, but they are seen in late fall. If this is a wild crabapple tree, so very small crab apples, so you wouldn't be growing them for your own culinary purposes, but they are a favorite bird food during the fall and winter months. And if you're going to plant a wild crabapple, make sure you get a variety that produces the fruit really late in the season because you want the tree to be bearing that fruit during the winter months. And if you get an early producing fruit, the fruit will be gone when the birds really need it in the winter. The other migrating bird that I've seen a lot of this year, particularly over here on Vancouver Island, is the varied thrush. So the varied thrush are often mistaken for robins as well, but when you look at them close up, they're distinctly different. They usually reside at higher altitudes, but in the winter, they come down to lower altitudes where they can forage without snow on the ground. And it's a male one on top with the black around its neck, and then the female one a little bit plainer looking. And again, the female one is on the holly berries, which are a favorite. So if you have any holly trees around, always be on the lookout in those trees for the variety of birds. What was really fun this winter is we had a snowfall, and normally these birds are fairly sleek, slim birds, but when it's cold outside, they puff up like a little puffer fish. And at one point in our very small backyard here, we had 12 of these puffed up thrushes all along the fence line waiting to get at the feeders. And normally they don't come to feeders, they're ground foragers, but when there's snow in the ground and they can't forage on the ground, it's a great time to be observing these birds at the feeders. And this was just kind of a cute winter picture here that's got a flicker and a robin on the right here and a couple of thrushes down below, likely all waiting to get their turn at a feeder when they can't do their usual foraging. So these next few slides are just going to be some of my favorite berry bushes that look nice for me, but also support the birds. So this one here is a beautyberry bush, or Calicarpa. So it has gorgeous berries that really shine once the leaves fall from this particular tree. And if you don't have too many birds in your yard, the purple berries last through most of the winter, but they are a very popular bird berry as well. The one in the middle was from a neighbor's yard that kept it fairly tightly pruned. So it was about 4 or 5 feet, well, actually about 4 feet tall, and was every year would be massively covered in the purple berries. The picture on the right is another neighbor who kind of let their calicarpa grow a bit bigger, and they had a much more naturalistic looking garden, but really stunning with the fall orange colors in the background. And this is my beautyberry. So for years, I used to wonder why I didn't get these lovely purple berries on my beautyberry bush. And I tried pruning it really hard. I tried letting it grow really big. And then a couple of years ago, it had massive amounts of green berries on it. So I thought, finally, I'm going to get a bumper crop of these purple berries. And the shrub was around the side of my house. So in the fall, it wasn't an area that I went by every day. And then one day I went around to the side of the house to admire all the beautiful purple berries, and this is what it looked like. And it dawned on me then that the reason I never have purple berries on this shrub is that I have so many birds in my garden that they eat all the berries before I get to enjoy it. But it's a small price to pay for having songbirds in the yard. Hawthorn is also a wonderful plant for pollinators and for bird food, berries in the fall. And it's a really great thing in Vancouver that the hawthorn tree has been used extensively as a boulevard tree. So you see a lot of them. Beautiful white flowers in the spring. It's a great pollinator plant. And then you have these berries that hang onto the tree for a long time and fall to the ground, but great fodder for the birds. This was a new shrub to me a few years back when I noticed it on one of my walks around the neighborhood. It goes by various names: choke cherry, bitter cherry, bird cherry, and its Latin name is Prunus virginiana. And actually, trees and shrubs in the genus Prunus rank third in the number of Lepidoptera that are supported by the foliage. So it really is one of the top host plants. It is a member of the rose family, and anything that's in the rose family is a really popular bird food. It does form sort of dense thickets. This was a planting on a boulevard, so likely none of these shrubs got watered. Most boulevard plantings don't get a whole lot of water in Vancouver. It's a very highly adaptable shrub, so it grows in many different conditions. And if it's growing on a boulevard, it's growing in very hard packed soil, probably had grass before these people decided to plant up their boulevard. It's got wonderful cylindrical flowers in the spring around May that have a really intoxicating honey smell. So it's really popular with early pollinators. And then it's got fantastic fall color for us with these black berries. And it is a really wonderful berry for the birds to have one of their big berry bird parties with. And then the last shrub I'm going to talk about is the ninebark, or the Physocarpus. I had one of these in my front garden, and I was just always amazed at how the number of birds that fed off of this tree all winter long. There is a native ninebark, the Pacific ninebark. There's also many hybrids of ninebark, so you can get whatever color ninebark that you want. The stems have this peeling foliage, so it has a lot of winter interest after it's lost most of its leaves, although I always find some leaves do hang on to this tree. It's got great flowers in the spring for pollinators. In the fall, it's got beautiful, the leaves change color to orangey tones, so it's very attractive fall color as well. And the seeds develop really late on this shrub, and they hang on to the shrub well into winter. This is a branch from my garden, but this tree would always be full of juncos and bush tits and chickadees eating these seeds. And I never had any pop up in other areas of the garden. So I think they just ate all the seeds from these trees, but it was really an amazing plant to have in the garden from a bird watching point of view. This next slide always makes me chuckle because there was certainly a time in my life when plants that looked like this would have prompted an intervention. And now I look at insect damage as sharing the bounty with those creatures that I share the garden with. All insect larvae feed on plants, and this is what nature intended them to do. So to have a true biodiverse garden, we need to be able to tolerate and allow a little leaf damage to really truly have a biodiverse garden. And most of us will recognize this chickadee holding a little green caterpillar as the green caterpillar that eats our chard and other brassicas that we plant in the garden. And most people think of chickadees as seed eaters, and this is true of adult chickadees. But when they are rearing their young, the chicks can't tolerate seeds, so they rely on insects. And according to Dr. Doug Tallamy, 96% of songbirds rear their young on insects, and most commonly on caterpillars. And there's the little cabbage white butterfly that produces the little green worms. So this slide is also from Dr. Doug Tallamy's work and his book, Bringing Nature Home. That's a really wonderful read. And according to his research, I can't imagine doing this research, but anyway, to rear one clutch of chicks, the chickadees must catch between 6,240 and 9,120 caterpillars. So that's a lot of caterpillars. We actually had for several years a pair of nesting chickadees in our garden in Vancouver. So I was more than happy to share my brassicas with the little worms, and they were always all over my vegetable garden, hopefully eating these worms because I still got lots of kale. So again, sharing the bounty from your gardens. This is my first of several Leave the Leaf posters I'm going to show you tonight. So basically the message is leave the leaves, don't blow, rake, or shred leaves this fall. Leave nature's mulch to sustain the birds, protect overwintering pollinators, insulate plant roots, and build living soil. So you don't need to over tidy your garden anymore. It's actually quite acceptable, and you have permission to leave it a little messy. In fact, my new mantra is cleaning up not at all is better than overdoing it. So when I look at gardens that have been kind of left to nature's devices, I think those people are right on the ball and doing the right thing. And I used to clean up my garden a lot more than I do these days. So there are many top 10 lists of plants for birds and everything else. I chose this particular top 10 list from a website called birdsandblooms.com, as these plants on this list I think are very accessible, and likely most of us are already growing them in our gardens. So the good news is that you're probably growing all the right plants already. We just need to be leaving those seed heads for the birds over winter and getting away from this neat and tidy garden cleanup that we've been taught for so long. And all of these plants are also favored by bees and butterflies for nectar and pollen. So all of these plants multitask as well, which is a great thing. I'm just going to highlight a couple of my favorites off of this list. I won't go through all 10 though. So alliums are one of my favorite garden plants. They grow from bulbs. The one in the picture here is called a garlic chive, and it's the latest blooming allium. It has beautiful white flowers in the fall. So I not only grow it as an edible, I grow it as an ornamental because I love white flowers, and to have something that blooms so late in the fall is really special. And the nice thing about these alliums is that because they bloom so late, they hold on to that seed throughout the winter. And you can see the heavy snowfall at Riley Park, and there are still lots of dried seed heads, which are like huge balls of seed for the birds, so they can't miss them. This is our native nodding onion, also an allium called Allium cernum, which is a great pollinator. It blooms kind of midsummer, so it drops its seeds on the ground, but makes great forage for the birds. And basically there is some kind of allium that will bloom all year long, or every month of the summer, you'll have something blooming. Allium molly is this yellow one, which is it's probably the first one to bloom, I think. And another favorite of mine is the drumstick allium, which blooms midsummer and naturalizes really nicely in the garden as well. Other garden favorites are echinacea. Echinacea have these wonderful spiky seed heads that I think look very attractive in the garden all year long. When you see this kind of seed dispersal from a seed head, that's the birds that are doing that. So when you start to look at the seed head that gets left on plants, I find it really exciting to see what the birds are eating in the garden. And the nice thing about echinacea seed heads is they really hold their shape on really sturdy stems, so they stand up to some of the winter weather. Rudbeckia or black-eyed Susans are also a really adaptable plant to have in the garden. They grow just about anywhere and tolerate shade and grow well in sun. And I think these black seed heads look fantastic in the winter garden. And it's really quite amusing watching the juncos try to bend the seed heads down so they can get better access to the seeds. Monarda or bee balm is another great garden plant. They've got very unusual shaped flowers that look very funky in the garden, and very stiff stems and great seed pods that look great. And again, you can see the birds have been feasting on these seed heads, very distinctive seed dispersal from the birds there. This is Monarda fistulosa, which is our native Monarda that blooms quite early in the season. And then again, Monardas are very long-lasting plants. They look like vibrant jewels in the garden. The red is scarlet bee balm, and I'm not sure the variety of this very tall purple one, but really long-lasting blooms and then long-lasting seed heads in the garden. Sedums are a great choice for any garden. Again, a very adaptable plant, very drought tolerant. So a good one to have in our gardens with these very drier and hotter summers we've been getting these days. The one pictured here is Sedum autumn joy. It's a very common variety, easy to find and propagate. And the blooms peak in the fall. So it gives you wonderful multi kind of rosy pink colored flowers in the fall. When you look at these flower heads, you sort of think about this as one big flower, but actually it is hundreds of these small tiny flowers. You can see the size of this bee next to the actual flower head, which means it produces a huge number of seeds. And I really love the look of these plants as they die back. They die back very slowly with these pink tinged flowers. And I always loved this scene at a church where I used to do my yoga classes pre-COVID, and they would have this long path of sedums that they would leave there for winter interest, and it always looked so beautiful. And lastly is grasses. Grasses are a great plant to provide protection for birds. And this is a Douglas aster, a native aster in front of the grass. A lot of people cut grasses back in the fall because they can get kind of messy with the snow and heavy rains. But I borrowed this technique from Van Dusen and just putting a string around the top of the grass and make this little haystack. So they hold their shape better for winter and creates great habitat for the birds. And then it looks just spectacular with a little bit of snow on the grasses. So it looks really nice for our eyesight as well, but provides lots of forage for the birds. The next couple of pictures are of a garden that I think has really pulled it together well, the whole concept of winter gardening, although this particular garden it's a 4-season garden for sure. It is a children's or infant memorial garden at Mountain View Cemetery. I used to live very close to here, and I always loved walking through this garden at any time of year. This picture was taken late October, so you can see the sedums are just starting to fade. It's the plant on the left, move forward again, there. The plant on the left is Coreopsis, which is a really prolific bloomer, which translates into a lot of seed for the birds. And then there's a spirea in the middle. So this was late fall, probably around, late October, November. And then this is the same garden, with that big silver tree in the background there with frost on the ground. This was taken in January, and you can see all the rudbeckia seed heads still providing winter forage for the birds. So, and it looks so much more interesting than seeing everything cut back. I also find for myself, seed heads in the fall look very beautiful in the garden. So it's always a shame when I see people cutting them back. These are phlomis seed heads, which are also often used for dried flower arrangements. And again, you can see this pattern of the birds pulling away at the seed heads here. Oh, and I meant to mention earlier, for any of us here that are seed collectors, we know that there are a lot of insects that also overwinter in seed heads of plants. So when the birds are after the seeds, they are often feasting on a lot of insects that are also overwintering in seed heads. This is a yarrow plant that holds up well over winter. This is teasel, which is the seeds of teasel is much loved by finches in the fall and holds up really well, very, very spiky. And then lunaria flowers, which have actually dropped most of their seeds, but look beautifully and translucent through the fall months. And then in winter, when those seed heads are touched by a little bit of frost, I think it brings absolute magic to our gardens. And I always love getting out there and taking pictures of frost on the plants. Last winter, in preparation for giving this talk, I went out and looked around the garden on a very snowy day to see what was actually available to feed the birds other than our bird feeders. This was a pyracantha shrub, which I've mentioned a couple times already, but lots of berries still available under a thick cover of snow. At Riley Park, we don't cut anything back in the winter. And this is yarrow that was poking out through about a foot of snow. So again, providing lots of seed for the birds. On the right was ocean spray. And this is a helenium plant here, the black seed head, so very similar to rudbeckia. Helenium blooms very late in the fall, so holds on to its seeds for a long time. And then, of course, the hawthorn tree still had lots of berries on very late in the season. On the left here, there's a very bright yellow colored bush. This is Choicea sundance, or Mexican mock orange is its other name. I think it gives a really wonderful pop of color on a winter landscape. It does suffer a bit of dieback if we have long prolonged cold days below zero, but it never dies back completely. So it's a great one for winter interest in the garden as well. So the last bird I'm going to talk about is the hummingbird. Now this bird is the only bird that also has a pollinator function in our garden. And the Anna's hummingbird overwintering behavior in the Pacific Northwest is a fairly recent phenomena in my lifetime. And it's related to changes in urban horticulture, so the plants that we're planting, as well as the proliferation of hummingbird feeders that everyone seems to have outside their houses now. This is the male Anna's hummingbird, who has this amazing magenta chest and head and looks kind of like a flying jewel in the garden. I hope people's screens are big enough to see this picture. So we think the hummingbird has a really long beak. And this photograph actually shows the tongue of the hummingbird, which is again the length of the beak. So they can really reach into very deep flowers or crevices in trees. And of course, our hummingbird feeders, they've got quite a reach there with that amazing looking tongue. I've never seen this, but this is a hummingbird in a state of torpor, but there are a ton of photographs of this on the internet. So hummingbirds, they are very tiny, as we know, and to survive the winter, they put themselves into this sort of state of suspended animation where they drop all their vital signs. So respiratory rate, heart rate, temperature, all drops to really near death levels. Somehow they manage to hold on to their perches. I've seen pictures of hummingbirds in a state of torpor at a hummingbird feeder. And they are able to live off their energy stores from the previous day's foraging. And this is a female Anis hummingbird, so it doesn't have the magenta head, and it is feeding off an Edgeworthia, and you can see its metallic green back and sort of grayish flanks on the female, so not quite as colorful as the male again, but very distinctive looking. So I've made it a habit to always, whenever I'm out walking, to always look at what's blooming when and really collect those early or late winter bloomers or early winter bloomers. One of my favorites, if you have room for it in your garden, is winter jasmine. So winter jasmine just started blooming in the last couple of weeks, and the hummingbirds absolutely love it. So it's so nice to see the hummingbirds be able to get nectar off of something other than the hummingbird feeders when we're still so early in the season. Another great nectar plant is Mahonia. All the Mahonias are good, or the Oregon grape family of plants. This is a hybrid called Charity that isn't so easy to get anymore, but there are other early hybrids, and this one starts blooming in December and looks quite spectacular and has really long blooms on it. Another wonderful shrub is Viburnum bonentense dawn. This starts blooming kind of late December around Christmas time. I see it first breaking out in bud, very fragrant buds, an absolutely gorgeous plant. Hellebores are also great pollinator plants. And there's some really early blooming ones that start blooming in December. Winter gold is one, ice and roses is another one. And camellias are another early blooming plant. This is a particularly early one called Yuletide that, you guessed it, blooms around Christmas time, but has really lovely single blooms. And then sort of the late winter bloomers are witch hazels, which I've noticed are just starting to come out in blooms right now. The Edgeworthia, which I showed a picture of earlier with the hummingbird. Sweet box or sarcococa has highly fragrant white flowers that bloom really early, and it also has blackberries that birds like to eat as well. And Daphne odora is a favorite of all gardeners as well for its stunning fragrance. And this dynamic duo here are a couple of native plants. So this is tall Oregon grape, or Mahonia aquifolium, I think, and flowering red currant. This picture was taken at Riley Park. It's an area adjacent to the parking lot. It gets no water and no attention whatsoever, and yet in the late spring or late winter, it has this absolutely fantastic display of flowers. So I think it's just such an amazing planting, and a combination planting of two native plants. The other hummingbird that we have in the Pacific Northwest is the rufous hummingbird, which is a true snowbird. So it travels over 3,000 kilometers to Mexico and South America. And the spring migration of the rufous hummingbird back to BC is perfectly timed to coincide with the flowering of the blooming of the flowering red currant. So that's kind of an amazing synchronicity of many plants. So I'm going to move on to bees and how they overwinter. So I will talk about nesting sites, and as well as some late fall and early spring bloomers that support those hungry emerging bees. So about 70% of our bees overwinter in the ground. And these include the miner bee, digger bee, sweat bees, and longhorn bees. So in order to hibernate in the ground, they actually need access to bare soil, which is not tilled and not turned over. So those undisturbed areas of the garden. And these little bees actually excavate holes in the garden. So they dig out the holes themselves, and they lay their eggs on this mixture called bee bread, which is a mixture of pollen, nectar, or fermented honey, and bee saliva. Sounds yummy. And this provides a food source for the overwintering and growing larvae. Some of the ground nesting bees are amongst the earliest to emerge in the spring, which makes them really important pollinators for some of our early fruit trees and early blooming plants. A bit of a hybrid is our bumblebees, which are cavity nesters, but they don't dig their own holes. They borrow other people's holes. So the bumblebees will nest in abandoned rodent holes. They'll also use cavities in dead wood or brush piles. So they're often seen emerging from wood piles or other surprising places like the compost pile or from under a shed or other sheltered areas. And the queen bumblebees are the first to emerge, and you will see the distinctive zigzag pattern of their flight pattern when they come out as they're searching for new nests in early spring. So they often look like they're sluggish or disoriented because they're flying back and forth in this rather haphazard pattern, but it's actually searching for a nest. And emerging from hibernation is also a really critical time for bees. They're basically starving at this point, and they need food not only for themselves, but for the first batch of offspring that's already growing in their bellies. This is myself and Lori Wiedenheimer at Riley Park Community Garden in front of the Xeriscape Garden. This is an area of the garden that has quite hard-packed soil. It's very, very dry, and we don't disturb the soil here at all because we're really trying to have a true xeriscape garden. And Lori and I discovered a ground bee habitat. You can actually see a little hole by my ankle there, but we discovered ground bee habitat in this area of the garden. So that's why we're both got big smiles on our faces. I'm sure you've probably had Lori speak at your meetings before, but she is a local bee enthusiast and activist. Is also author of Victory Gardens for Bees. And Lori and myself were part of the design team for Riley Park Community Garden, and it's been a really great pleasure and opportunity for me working closely with Lori at Riley Park, and I'll show you a few of our collaborations a little bit later. And there's just a close-up of a little bee excavating a hole. This is a meadowscape planting that we don't see very much of in our urban environment, but this is a house very close to Riley Park. And this couple, they've planted their own boulevard and a neighbor's boulevard, and their entire front and back gardens are planted like this as well. So this type of planting also creates really good ground nesting habitat for our bees. So the other 30% of bees are called or overwinter in stems. So they're called our stem nesting native bees. And they include leafcutter, mason bees, resin bees, carpenter bees, and yellow-faced bees. They also lay their eggs in this bee bread mixture. And some of the stem nesting bees, like mason bees and leafcutter bees, will also use the man-made nesting boxes. And I'm sure everyone has had a mason bee house at some point. So for stem nesting bees, it's a little bit more complicated than first meets the eye and how you want to support those stems in your garden. And this poster here from Healthy Yards, I think, does a fairly good job of explaining it. So we'll start off with spring. So the stem in the middle is a stem that has had its flowers cut off from the previous year. And the two stems to the side are from the year before. And it's the year before stems that will have this year's bees emerging from the stems. And sorry, I keep bouncing back. The mouse is a little bit sensitive here. And then in spring and summer, the new growth has come up. The old stems that the bees emerged from have now fallen down, but the previous year's stem is still sturdy enough and it is hidden by the now blooming plant, but it is still there. And that stem now has had time for the pith in the center of the stem to hollow out. So it is now a hollow stem, which is where in the summer, the bees will now lay their eggs in that last year's hollow stem. And the new generation will emerge the following spring. So in the fall and winter, you will see the previous year's hollow stem that is now the nesting site, and then the blooms have been left on this year's stem as they should be to feed the birds. So this is a fennel plant that we have growing at Riley Park. And while I love fennel and I'm all for leaving seeds on plants, fennel produces many thousands of seeds. So it is a plant that I chop back once the seeds start to get near the point where they're going to drop, or you would have thousands of seedlings in your garden. But you can see here the previous year's stems are the ones that have the holes in. So that's where insects will have, stem nesting insects will be overwintering. And then this year's stems that have been cut back are still green. They're still filled with the pith, and they will be the hollow stems for the following year. And then we just let the new growth emerge around these old stems, and you don't even really notice that the old stems are there. This is a couple of resin bees that are nesting in an old stem. And these are some of the common nesting plants. So again, a familiar sort of list, some of the plants I've mentioned already, but these plants tend to have the right size stem for stem nesting bees. Now, I'm not suggesting that you leave stems on every single plant in the garden unless you want to do that. But in my own garden, I have certain plants from this list that I always leave the stems intact, and other things I tidy up. So it just depends on the plant, and you can sort of pick and choose your stems, but these are the favorite nesting sites. So I've mentioned Riley Park several times, and this is a lovely pictorial picture of the park that was taken with some drone footage that we had. I became a butterfly ranger in 2017, and we had just sort of planted Riley Park, or started the plantings in Riley Park the previous year. So it really became my working ground and experimental ground for putting a lot of these gardening practices into actual practice in the garden. Riley Park Community Garden is quite a large, it's a communal community garden. It's 1,065 square meters. It is in the Little Mountain neighborhood at the base of Queen Elizabeth Park, at the corner of 30th and Ontario. If you want to come visit at any time, it is an open garden. The farmers market happens on this plaza here, and across the winter market is across the street at Nat Bailey. So come to the market and come visit this garden. It is quite something. Lori Wiedenheimer was the design team lead when I joined the team, and it is because of her that every single plant that was put in this garden has a pollinator function, and I thank her for that because I wasn't quite on board at that time. And these are the vegetable beds here, and there's quite a large edible food forest and herb gardens and orchard. But the periphery of this garden, so all along the south border and throughout the whole garden, is all surrounded by pollinator plantings. So it's a fairly unique garden in that way. The other thing I love about this photograph is the trees. So we inherited a few trees on this pocket of land. In the center is this lovely big silver fir, and this is a cedar tree over here. And this tree on the left is our mighty oak. And when you're on the ground looking up, all these trees kind of look to be the same size. And it didn't occur to me till I saw this aerial footage how much bigger the oak tree is than all the other trees combined practically in the garden. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about oak trees a little bit later in the presentation. These are a couple of the collaborations that I had done with Lori in the garden. We developed 4 seasonal plants, 4 seasonal plant maps for the garden that sort of highlight the favored pollinator plants in the garden, as well as who we're seeing in terms of our pollinators in the garden, which are down at the bottom of this map. So there's maps for spring and summer, which I'm not showing you tonight, that obviously have a lot more plant material, but these are plants that were all blooming in the fall, and these are all the insects at the bottom that we see in the garden at this time. All the photographs are taken by Lori. A few of my photographs are in there, but they're all actual photographs from the garden and actual pollinators that we see in the garden. And then we've got one for the winter as well. All of these maps are available on the Riley Park Community Garden website. They are downloadable. They're free, free downloads. So you can go have a look at what we have in the garden and then go look at it in person, whatever season you happen to be in the garden. So you'll see by the winter pollinator map that there's much less plants blooming. We have a lot of late winter plants blooming along our woodland border here. And then we created this winter pollinator corner because winter is a difficult time for pollinators, especially some of those early emerging queens. And it's nice to have the plants sort of concentrated in an area so they don't have to fly too far to find things. And at the bottom of this page are all the types of insects that we actually find in the garden. So during the winter's month, we had an Anna's hummingbird, honeybee, and 5 types of bumblebees were in the garden during the winter months. So still lots going on during that time. This is some of the signage that we have in the garden. This particular signage is in our winter pollinator corner of the garden. And some of our winter pollinator plants are winter blooming heathers, the winter blooming hellebores, winter aconites, a beautiful little early bulb, primroses. This is primrose wanda, I believe. Snowdrops, another bulb, crocuses, great little pollinator, wood violet that is also a host plant for butterflies, and our Pacific bleeding heart as well. And we also have a viburnum dawn in this winter pollinator corner of the garden as well. So I'm going to move on to butterflies and talk a little bit about their winter habitat, as well as host plants, which provide a food source for the young and in turn attract butterflies because they want to lay their eggs where their young are going to be able to find food. So Real Gardens Grow Native is a website that I encourage people to check out. And host plants are really where native plants become vital to butterfly survival as well as other native insects. I intentionally haven't made this presentation entirely about native plants, as most gardeners I know, including myself, like to have a mixture of native and non-native plants in our home garden. However, native plants are really the core of any wildlife garden. So native plants really understand nature's logic. They're adapted to our local wet winters and our dry drought periods we have during the summer. They require less water, usually less maintenance, and hopefully they're pesticide free because they're native plants. They usually don't attract the same pesticides as pests as introduced plants. Native plants also multitask in that they provide nectar sources for multiple species, host plants for caterpillars, and of course seeds and fruit in the winter for the birds. And as I've already mentioned, they are perfectly timed to bloom to coincide with various migrating species. The intentional use of native plants, which have formed symbiotic relationships with native wildlife over millions of years, really does create the most productive and sustainable wildlife habitat. So once again, Mother Nature rules. Studies have shown that native plants are 4 times more alluring to pollinators than introduced species of plants. And a really great goal, I think, that many presenters are banding about now is to have a goal of a minimum of 50% native plants in your garden, which I think is a really great goal to work towards. So this, the next several slides are the work of entomologist Dr. Douglas Tallamy and his University of Delaware research team. And I was introduced to this work through the Butterfly Project. They actually had Dr. Tallamy speak on one of our webinars, which really was just amazing research. And Dr. Tallamy has identified what he calls keystone plants. So keystone plants are native plants critical to the food web and necessary for multiple wildlife species to complete their life cycle. And these plant species also support the life cycle of insects over multiple stages of that life cycle. So the slide on the left shows that the majority of herbivores, like caterpillars, are specialized to feed on just one or very few host plants. And then the graph on the right illustrates that his team identified that 14% of native plants, and these are the keystone species, support 90% of butterfly and moth lepidoptera species. So when we have a goal of 50% native plants, this work really helps us narrow down on what the most important native plants are to be putting into our gardens. Without these keystone species in our landscapes, butterflies, native bees, and birds will not survive. He also goes on to say in his book, Bringing Nature Home, that 96% of our land birds rely on insects supported by these keystone species. So if we remove these plant species from our environments, particularly our urban environments, we remove the insects that they rely on for food sources, so our bird populations also start to decline. So the top genera of keystone species are trees, and the top tree by a long shot is the mighty oak. So the mighty oak supports over 940 species of caterpillars and other insects. Now, this data is from the US, but I expect it's not that much different up here. So including these keystone species in managed ecosystems will more efficiently restore the insect diversity, which in turn supports other wildlife that need insects to survive. The picture on the right shows a graph which illustrates that yards with no keystone species produced 75% less caterpillars and 60% less breeding chickadees. And the chickadees that did still breed in those yards produced fewer eggs and fewer fledglings survived. Now, I know we don't all have room for oak trees in our yard. This is a picture from Riley Park under that big oak tree that I showed you in the previous picture with some little oak seedlings. When you do have an oak tree in your yard, you deal with a lot of acorns and oak seedlings around. But while we all don't have picture for oak trees, there are a lot of hybrid species of smaller versions of trees, which I think are a little bit more suitable for our urban yards. I don't know if they wouldn't support the same volume of insect populations, but I think it's worth a try looking to plant some of these, and maybe somebody could start studying some of these hybrids to see if we're doing our wildlife any favors. This was a new house a block away from where I used to live, and this was a tiny little columnar oak tree in their front yard. Then I don't know what the species of it was, but I didn't know oak trees grew like that, so it just made me curious. This was another cylindrical maple tree growing on the boulevard, so that would have been planted by the Parks Board. And this is a birch tree. Again, it's probably about less than 10 feet high, weeping in a front yard. In Vancouver, I had 4 40 to 50 foot birch trees growing along the west side of the property, and they were host to so much wildlife. They were really wonderful trees to have in the garden, but they did require many thousands of dollars spent on arborists keeping them in check. And some of these smaller ones, I think, are much easier to maintain in some of our yards. However, It is not enough to simply plant big trees in our yards. And to continue with that, the outdated neat and tidy garden philosophy is not going to help biodiversity. And this brings us to the work of Heather Holmes and her research team. And she has coined this phrase called soft landings. So soft landings are diverse native plantings under keystone trees or any other regionally appropriate native tree. The plantings provide critical shelter and habitat for one or more life cycle stages of moths, butterflies, and beneficial insects. In addition to plants at the bases of the trees, soft landings also include leaf litter, duff, and other plant debris. So the bottom line is don't clean up that stuff that drops at the bottom of the tree. The graphic to the left reiterates that oak trees support over 940 types of caterpillars, again, US data. And on the right, it illustrates that many of the moths and butterflies that feed on oak trees must complete their life cycle in the leaf litter and duff at the base of those trees, particularly during the winter months. So instead of this, we want this. So this is a really simple little boulevard planting in the neighborhood. Many would look at this and think this person wasn't looking after their yard properly, but this is actually always brings a smile to my face because you see the leaf litter, you see the branches, a perennial planting under this tree at other times of the year. So this is where the caterpillars and the things that live in that tree can spend their winter. The previous picture that I showed with the trees without any leaf litter under them, those are probably really unhealthy trees as well, because all the organic matter that normally feeds the trees is being removed constantly and hard packed lawn underneath. So this not only feeds the soil and all the insects, it makes for much healthier trees. This is back to this slide that I showed already. Of this meadowscaping in our urban environment. This particular garden is along just off of 33rd Avenue on Ontario heading north. It's worthwhile taking a look at this. There's always something going on and it looks particularly alive during the winter months. Sorry about my mouse. Here we go. All right. And I just wanted to talk briefly about the skipper butterflies. So we don't actually see skippers much in Vancouver because they like meadows and we don't really have many meadowscapes in Vancouver. The flicker butterfly is very small. You can see it here on an aster. So the aster flower is less than 2 centimeters in diameter and the flicker butterfly is about half that. If you want to see a lot of flickers in their natural habitat, go to Terra Nova Park in Richmond. It is full of them. And the larvae of the skippers actually feed on grass. And skippers overwinter in a caterpillar state, so in their larval state, and they go into diapause, which again is that kind of a suspended animation. And they do this in grasses and leaf litter at the bases of grasses. So if we remove all our meadows and natural grasses, we will not have these little flicker butterflies. And it would be so nice if we were able to bring some of them back to Vancouver by having more meadowscapes around. So I've talked about trees as keystone plants, but Dr. Ptolemy's research, he divides different ecosystems, and the one that we're in is the marine west coast forest. And so these are the shrubs and perennials that are keystone shrubs and perennials in our environment. So for shrubs, shrubby willow, vaccinium species that are blueberries, huckleberries, cranberries, blackberries, rose, serviceberry, Saskatoon berry, and cornus and dogwood. And I've shown you a few pictures of those already, and you will recognize some of the perennial plants that I've already mentioned as well. So I'm going to finish off with butterflies by just showing how different species overwinter in different stages of their life cycle. So some butterflies overwinter in their egg stage. So that pine white is the more common one, as well as the purplish copper. So the picture on the bottom here, that's of a pine needle. And so the pine white eggs are laid along one individual pine needle. So you can imagine how tiny those are. And obviously they must freeze during the winter and then somehow thaw out and survive to emerge into larvae in the spring. Other butterflies overwinter in the larval stage, and the most, I've mentioned skipper already, and a more common one that we see is Lorquin's admiral, and this is an admiral hibernacula. So they have made this little cozy home for them in a leaf. Eventually that leaf would drop to the ground and be part of leaf litter under a tree. So one more reason not to be cleaning up those leaves. And then on the top picture, that's our Western tiger swallowtail, which is our big showy butterfly out west. And they actually hibernate in a pupa stage, and they attach themselves to bark of big trees. So where I actually see the most swallowtails in Vancouver is down at Jericho when I'm on my way to the beach and walk through the forest. They're full of swallowtails there because those trees are the host plants for swallowtails and where they overwinter. And then there's the group of butterflies that overwinter in their adult stage. And I find these the most curious of all. This is a mourning cloak that basically attaches itself to bark and completely dehydrates itself. But because it overwinters in an adult stage, it is one of the earliest butterflies that you see in spring. And they often look quite raggedy in spring because they've just come out of winter hibernation, and then subsequent generations of them will look a little bit more vibrant. And you can see mourning cloaks, well, in the neighborhood I used to live in Vancouver, up around Queenie Park with all the big trees, because that's where they overwinter. So the last Leave the Leaf poster. So during the winter months, fall leaves can serve as shelter for overwintering chrysalis and other pollinators, and as a source of food for insects. And this poster is off of the Joyful Butterfly website, which is a great nursery in the US, but a great source of material for plants that butterflies like to eat. These are a couple of maps that are also downloadable on the Riley Park website. We did, so as well as the 4 seasonal pollinator maps, we did maps for butterfly nectar plants as well as butterfly host plants. And these are all plants we have at Riley Park. This is a demonstration I did for Pollinator Week a couple of years ago, and the bouquet on the left are nectar plants and the bouquet on the right are host plants. Pollinator Week is always at the end of June, so these were all things that were blooming in the garden at the end of June. So you can see by these pictures that while host plants may not be quite as colorful as the nectar plants, they can certainly provide lots of beautiful blooms in the garden, as well as that host plant function for our butterflies. So I just put one slide in about catkins because I really love catkins on big trees. So catkins are actually flowers with no petals on them. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes and have successing different trees have catkins blooming at different times. So this is really great for our pollinators as well. And we don't normally think of trees as providing pollen for pollinators, but they do. So this picture here is a corkscrew hazel, and it shows catkins at 2 different stages of development. And this tree probably has a few pine cones left on from the previous winter as well, which would be a source of food for the birds. There's a little bush tit claiming a little dried catkin cone on a tree. Scowler's willow produces catkins a little bit later in the spring, from March to May. Now, Scowler's willow is a host plant for butterflies, for our western swallowtail, for mourning cloaks, and Lorquin's admiral. So if you got room for it in your garden, it's a good one to have around. And then birch trees also have late spring catkins developing. Birch trees are a very fast growing tree that produce a ton of seeds and are also one of those top keystone trees that support over 300 species of insects. And also the insects are food for the birds, as well as the seeds provide food for the birds over winter. And there's a little bee with his pollen sacks full of pollens that he's gotten off a catkin. Oak and alder trees also have catkins on them. So in closing tonight, I would hope that people take this information, and if you are not already, and I think I'm speaking to the converted here, but be a guardian of ecosystem diversity. One way to start this is by adding more native plants to your own landscape with that goal of 50%. Also to restore, maintain, and enhance the natural habitat, both in your own yards and in your communities. Volunteer your time in community greening projects, and from the sounds of it, a lot of you are already doing this. Find out who the wildlife are that coexist with you and support them with plants and sustainable gardening practices, and find out who's missing from your environment, who used to live here, and try to entice them to return by gardening practices and plants. And enjoy the diversity and serendipity that results from a lessening of control in your urban environments. And after all, the ideal gardening spirit seeks a living dynamic, which is the life we all want for ourselves, and the natural world is no different. Just finishing with a couple of resources. These are some pollinator bingo cards that Lori Wiedenheimer developed, also available for download. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, a lot of people think that there's not a lot of interesting things going on in the garden in winter. So Lori came up with this idea of these bingo cards. Now she's got them for all the seasons, but I find the winter one particularly charming. And she goes into sort of detailed describing about different things to look for in the winter garden. She's also got these bingo cards for nectar and host plant bingo. This is one of my favorite resources, particularly to share with people that are trying to create pollinator gardens, from the Fraser Valley Conservancy. These tables include growing conditions, bloom time, what pollinators different native plants attract, whether they produce fruits or seeds or berries, attracting birds, etc. This is all on their way online. You used to be able to order booklets. I'm not sure if you can still do that, but it is a really wonderful website. Another favorite source is the Invasive Plant Council of BC, because you still see people planting invasive plants out there. And this website, as well as they used to produce booklets, will have a list of all the invasive plants that you shouldn't plant in your garden, and it will have alternative plants that have similar in look and similar in growing conditions, and they list an ornamental plant option as well as a native plant option. So it's a nice way to get people planting more native plants. This is a resource list from my presentation. I have sent this to Dennis and Teresa. I'm not sure if it's something that can be sent to participants today. That's usually how I share this list. So if you want to look up any of the sites that I've mentioned during the talk, they're all there. And that's it. Thank you very much.